Rangobart opened his eyes to find Lady Wagner and Dimir staring across the cabin at him. He yawned and stretched, looking groggily out of the windows, but the lack of any scenery showed that they were still traveling on the highway between Fiorizo and Fioburkana. Rather than return to the surface to resume their way to the Dwarven Kingdom's capital overland, the highway went underground, following the route of an old Dwarven highway connecting the cities of their ancient realm. According to Lady Wagner, the route underground only needed a bit of a clean-up to make serviceable again, as Dwarven construction was built to last. Short of the demon gods or rampaging dragons, not much could cause any real damage to it. He turned his attention back to the cabin, where the two young noble women were still looking at him. "What?" he asked. "Loud," Dimir said, "your snoring is so loud." "Yeah," Lady Wagner said, "I thought the mountain might collapse on us. The carriage would have been fine, though." Frian threw on 8 blankets trying to absorb the sound. On the far end of his side of the cabin, Frian's head was sticking out of a pile of lizardman blankets, her waves of golden hair draped over the patterned fabric. He was beginning to think that the imperial princess might pass for a lizardman herself. "How long until we reach Fioburkana?" Rangobart asked. "Shouldn't be long, now," Lady Wagner answered. "Unlike Fiorizo, though, there are some procedures we have to go through. We'll at least have to meet with a representative from the Regency Council and do all of the stuff they have planned for us." "What sort of stuff?" "Probably a banquet, plus whatever they want to show you. The city was just reclaimed a year ago, so there are probably some ruined parts of the kingdom they don't want us to see. Not that they need to make any excuses for it, but you know how it is." "Does it have anything to do with the stuffiness attributed to imperial citizens that Guildmaster Granite Shield mentioned?" Frian asked. "Probably. Once you start going down that road, you get caught up in all sorts of things that suck up your time. Most dwarves are pretty to the point, but the Regency Council's concerned with the prestige of their kingdom and all that heady stuff." "Is there something wrong with that?" "No, but yes. Think of what you're here for, I guess, or what comes to mind when the humans around here think of dwarves. I bet it ain't anything about their fabulous parties. You're here for their renowned metalwork and stonework. Everything else is pretty much a distraction, and a costly one when your time is limited. Formality for the sake of formality." "I'm sure that my Lord Father and the members of his party will appreciate such a welcome," Rangobart said. "On the surface, sure," Lady Wagner shrugged. "But I sometimes wonder if other nobles get impatient with it. I've always preferred it when people put their money where their mouth is. Maybe it's my merchant blood getting the better of me." "I think your mannerisms have their own charm," Rangobart said. "Most of the imperial knights that I know would rather deal with someone like you over someone like my Lord Father." He, think so?" Lady Wagner scratched her cheek with a finger. "Maybe I should explore that avenue with everything the Empire's up to these days." The highway suddenly opened up to reveal a massive underground chamber set aglow by countless lights. Rangobart leaned back so Frian could see past him, looking down at the cityscape as the highway rolled down an incline cut into the cavern wall. "Fioburkana, I presume," he said. "Yes, sir," Lady Wagner replied. "Home to approximately 80,000 mountain dwarves." Rangobart eyed the towering, multi-level structures that rose from the cavern floor and crawled up its walls. "This seems like it would house far more than 80,000 dwarves," he said. "According to what the dwarves could recover from the city's archives," Lady Wagner said, "this city was once able to house over 1 million. 1 million? A furrow appeared on Frian's brow. "Our winter barely has over 100,000. How did they feed themselves?" Have you seen what they eat?" Lady Wagner said. "You could probably knock dragons out of the sky with the stuff. In all seriousness, it's because of the way they develop their land. They build in 3 dimensions. If humans have a farming village with fields all around it, dwarves have 100 farming villages and their fields stacked on top of one another. It's warm down here too, if you haven't noticed. It's growing season all the time. This city you see down there is the heart of a vast underground kingdom, or at least it used to be." "What happened to them?" Rangobart asked. "The demon gods. Frost dragons. Quagua. One thing after another that never gave them a chance to recover. When the Sorcerer King found them, they had 1 city left and that city was hours from falling to a Quagua siege." Rangobart's gaze sobered as he continued to take in the details of the city. An entire civilization had nearly passed into darkness not a day from the imperial border. How come the Empire never heard about their plight? Rangobart asked. The dwarves used to send merchants in the past. Why not ask for help or send their people to safety? It wasn't as if they had nothing to offer in return. That's something you'll have to ask them, Lady Wagner said. When I did, they almost seemed content with the fact that they were in decline, which doesn't make much sense at all to me. They were on the verge of extinction, yet only a tiny fraction of their total population was in the military. It's as if they were just sitting there, waiting to die. You're right, Rangobard nodded. That doesn't make any sense. You'd think they'd at least try to save who they could. But you did also mention that they were under siege. They were under siege by the Quagua, a subterranean race that stay blind. All the dwarves had to do was walk up to the surface and stroll over to East Estate. It's not as if it was inconceivable. They have some farms above ground in the mountain valleys along the way. That was indeed strange. Why choose extinction over an easy, unchallenged escape on a path well traveled? All he could think of was some racial attribute that precluded that sort of thinking and that didn't bode well for the dwarven race as a whole. Their carriage slowed as the highway brought them close to the floor of the cavern. There, they joined a long line of smaller vehicles all drawn by soul eaters. Looks like they got used to the undead real quick, Dimir said. Where are all these wagons from? Most are all wagons lined up to enter the industrial quarter. You can tell which ones they are 'cause they don't use our new cargo containers. The rest should be divided into food shipments, mostly pickled greens and liquor, from the Sorceress Kingdom and freight from Fiordura. We should get past most of it after this junction. This is quite the snarl, Frian said. It's like the morning markets on arena days. A feature of dwarven planning, I guess, Lady Wagner said. Or maybe defensive planning in general. They don't like having any more ways in than necessary, so all of the traffic goes through bottlenecks like this road through their foreign quarter. How is the rest of the city laid out? There's the industrial quarter, the common quarter, and the palace quarter. The dwarves have homes in every part of the city. That huge pillar in the middle alone can probably house 250,000. The members of the upper crust live in the palace quarter, of course. I'll let our hosts fill you in on all of the details. As mentioned, once they got past the junction to the industrial quarter, most of the traffic disappeared. Though it was called a foreign quarter, there were still crowds of dwarves lining the streets going about their business. It's much brighter here than in Fiorizo, Dimir said. You can actually see stuff. Well, it's called the foreign quarter for a reason. The surface entrance was back near where we joined the traffic and most visiting merchants do their business here. Dwarves can get around just fine without light, but not their guests from the surface. How many people come from the Empire? Lady Wagner looked across the cabin at him. They could see humans sticking out over the dwarven crowds, but it was impossible to tell where they were from at a glance. To be honest, I'm not sure, he said. I know that dwarf merchants started coming down from the mountains shortly after the official creation of the Sorceress Kingdom. Logically speaking, some of the Empire's merchants must have also started using the trade route. I suppose that's to be expected, Lady Wagner shrugged and smiled. Wherever you are, customs officers only care about collecting tolls and taxes from incoming merchants. Where they leave to is the problem of the next set of customs officers. It was a flippant way to put it, but the Countess wasn't wrong. Exported goods were money in one's pocket, so to speak. He supposed that countries at war might inspect outbound caravans for spies, but the Empire wasn't in any such situation. At best, there were spot inspections by the Imperial Air Service, but the frontier east of East Estate wasn't the Empire's jurisdiction. Wouldn't the customs officers register returning Imperial merchants? Frian asked. It's too soon for that, Lady Wagner said. It had taken exclusive trade contract with an imperial house for imperial merchants to edge out the dwarves exporting the goods that they themselves produce. Setting up one of those takes forever, so you won't have any goods coming through that route yet. The only feasible way to beat the dwarves at their own game at this stage is to use undead logistics to nullify feed and labor costs. This woman is quite the fox. She even has no problems referring to herself as a merchant noble. Imperial nobles might leverage merchant connections as a way to display their influence, but saying that one was a merchant was admitting that they were the lowest of the low. Merchants had no titles, no tenancies, and existed at the grace of those who issued their licenses. Lady Wagner flaunted her merchant background instead of hiding it as a normal person would. Methods that nobles would turn their noses up at were no obstacle to her, and she presented her views with charming displays of confidence. He wasn't sure if she would carry herself in the same manner with the other houses in his father's party, but her tactics were made plain to everyone in the carriage. If the Empire wished to compete with its neighbors in the region, then they had to use the Sorceress Kingdom's undead. Every display of economic and industrial might was a fruit to tempt the nobles of the Empire with, and the first to fall to temptation would kick off an unstoppable cascade of ambition, desperation, and greed. Indeed, it seemed that they had little choice in the matter. As demonstrated with the Azalesian mountain dwarves, and purportedly the Draconic Kingdom, the lease of the Sorceress Kingdom's undead was not limited to its client states. They could very well move on to Carnassus, and they didn't need the Empire's permission to do so. The scenes beyond the window darkened as they crossed into the city's common quarter. Not only had the lighting dimmed to something not much better than Fiorizo, but the way buildings were fashioned had changed. Everything was crafted with dwarven frames in mind, from the quarter's side streets to its apartments to the businesses on the cavern floor. Pretty insular, huh? Lady Wagner said. Colin asserts that art and architecture is the fastest way to understand a society, and I'm inclined to agree. Does that mean you also agree with her assessment of the Baharuth Empire? Frian asked. I'd be an idiot if I didn't, Lady Wagner answered. I think the issues are pretty plain to see as an outsider. As a citizen of the Empire, however, all of the feelings and experiences and normal get in the way. I'm afraid I don't follow, Rango Bart said. Colin has an overarching theory about how culture acts as a protocol between a race's nature and the realities that it sees around itself, Frian said. She asserts that true civilizational mastery lies not in having people adhere to the requirements of any particular societal framework, but instead engineering all aspects of a civilization to generate a societal framework that its members naturally fit into. I'm afraid I still don't follow. It's a monstrously complex subject, Frian admitted with a sigh. I was always hailed as the genius of the Academy, but even after being in Colin's company for weeks, I found myself no closer to grasping what she speaks of than when I first arrived. All I know is that there's something to it, and one can only see the result that manifests in Colin County. That's pretty normal, Lady Wagner said. Geniuses pick up on things that most people aren't even aware of, but they have a heck of a time explaining that understanding. I think the only people who seemed to have at least some idea of what she was talking about were some of the members of the royal court, and that's only because they're ridiculously smart and know a bunch of stuff themselves. As far as experts go in the Sorceress Kingdom, however, Colin towers above everyone else in her own field. The only thing she can do is create examples for others to analyze at their leisure, because talking mostly doesn't work. We can have a little exercise of our own though. Lady Wagner's attention went to the window, where the overly cozy structures of the city were passing by. Just from the design of this city, she said, what can you infer about its people? That they're short, Dimir said. Sure, Lady Wagner said, let's categorize that as a reality of their physical forms. What else about the city stands out to you that might suggest something about the character of its citizens? That they desire stability, maybe, Rango Bart said. Everything about dwarven architecture that I've seen so far is very solid. You mentioned that thing about their infrastructure earlier, as well. They're willing to suffer everyday inconveniences for the sake of overall security. How does that compare to common imperial perceptions of dwarves? Lady Wagner asked. It's not that far off. What people believe to be customary dwarven behavior is pretty much in line with what we see in their architecture. The question is whether one causes the other or not. It doesn't have to necessarily be one thing or the other, Lady Wagner said. In fact, you might say that we instinctively recognize them as being parts of the same thing. What about now? Their carriage passed through another gate, which opened up into a far more spacious environment. His mind made an immediate connection to the spacious layouts of the Empire's wealthy districts. Rich people are the same wherever you go, Dimir said. You sure about that? Rango Bart leaned closer to the window, trying to figure out what Lady Wagner was getting at. They crossed a landscape of stone plazas, sculptures, fountains, and canals that were unlike anything in the other parts of the city. It certainly seemed like the telltale trappings of a wealthy neighborhood. I see, Frian said. Their values aren't exactly the same as what one would consider human. It might be difficult for us to tell because we grew up in our winter, which has many works of monumental architecture. What the design of the district is in service to is key. Everything is built to frame history. She's right. In our winter, the estates of the elite took up a great deal of space. What was taking up all of the space in Fioberkana's palace quarter, however, was the monumental architecture that told the story of the dwarves' past. The stone plazas, fountains, canals, and most of the lighting were built around statues, murals, and other monuments. Even the works that looked like they had been eaten down to their foundations were treated with the utmost reverence. In contrast, the manners of the dwarven elite and the businesses that serviced them didn't look too much different from the structures in the common quarter, at least from the limited perspective of the carriage window. This seems simple enough, Rangobat said. It's not that much different from our training as nobles. It is, and it isn't, Lady Wagner told him. Understanding that something is important doesn't let you know how you should behave. Humans are used to dealing with other humans and we tend to frame other people in familiar terms even if they're not the same race as us. That's a big no-no. You only know when you know. Assuming that you do is just setting yourself up for trouble. The carriage rolled onto a wide promenade, at the end of which was a massive palatial structure set aglow in ice blue light. If one followed the logic presented by the rest of the quarter, the royal palace of Fioberkana wasn't merely the headquarters of the Dwarf Kingdom's government, but the heart of its culture and history. Maybe that's why they never asked for help. Pride over their history, and shame over losing it. That reason, at least, was somewhat understandable. They stopped alongside the broad curb before the palace. Rangobat was the first to step out of their carriage. Roughly 50 meters away, a line of dwarves stood at the bottom of the palace steps. From his place much closer to the street, a single dwarf with a combed black beard came forward. Yo, Kadir, Lady Wagner grinned. They still using the merchant guild to do this? You know how it is, the dwarf replied. Everyone's still occupied by reconstruction and recovery. Practical matters. And the only thing practical about foreign affairs is trade. I gotcha. Dimir stirred, but Lady Wagner plopped her hand atop her head. It was an inexcusable approach by the standards of human diplomacy, but they weren't dealing with humans. This is Kadir Silvershield, Lady Wagner said. A deputy of the Merchant Guild. Kadir, this is Frian Gushmand, head court mage of the Baharuth Empire. She's mostly here for personal dealings as Countess Waldenstein and a member of House Gushmand, though. Dimir Eriks here's a member of the Imperial Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Say something mean about foreign affairs and she'll bite ya. Rangobat is Rangobat. A pleasure to meet ya, Kadir nodded. So, no one's officially here as a representative of the Empire, right? Yup, Lady Wagner nodded. Like we said before, it'll all be personal business. Actually, why are you here, Dimir? Technically, the ministry let me come as a part of work. Oh. That's too bad. I guess you'll get a lonely cold room in the palace while the rest of us enjoy ourselves in the city. No. Forget I said anything. Frian cleared her throat. Are there any customs we should be aware of before greeting our hosts? She asked. No. To be blunt, they'll only stick around for as long as you have business with them since it isn't a state visit. As far as outsiders are concerned, the only part of the Regency Council that's guaranteed to be staying is the Merchant Guild. The rest depends on what you're here for. The Merchant Guild is a part of the Dwarf Kingdom's government. It's better to treat them as a sort of Ministry of Trade, Lady Wagner told them. No commerce happens without their approval. There are other positions that you won't find in the Imperial Court Council, but they're understandable enough. I sure hope so. At least he was just Rangobat. Any mistakes would be Frian's to make. Kadir Silvershield led them to the line of waiting ministers, who almost seemed ragtag in their appearance. Some were finely dressed while others were adorned in occupational garb, assuming that it wasn't ceremonial. As they were introduced to each in turn, he couldn't decide whether the positions, which each correlated to an industrial field, were indicative of a primitive political system or simply the remnants that they could cobble together out of their former government. In any case, what's the point of having a minister for beer? He tried to imagine an entire arm of the imperial administration dedicated to liquor, but the concept was so alien that any coherent ideas about the institution failed to coalesce. As Kadir suggested, the members of the Regency Council only stayed for long enough to figure out whether they had anything to do with the visit. They peeled away with their attendants until only the Master of Caves and Mines, the Forge Master, the Director of Food Production, and the Master of the Merchant Guild remained. "Let's take our discussion to a more suitable location, shall we?" The Master of the Merchant Guild said. "I believe we've just missed the lunch crowd at the Diamond Plate. It's just this way." The other ministers seemed disinterested in the fact that the Merchant Guild had taken the lead. Such a development would be unthinkable in the Empire. If it did happen, an assassination or two would have undoubtedly followed as a gentle reminder to any upstarts to know their place. They were led to a dining establishment several blocks from the palace gate. Rango Bhatt took his seat at a table that was far less cramped than expected. He tested the stony furnishings and found them astonishingly comfortable, then looked up to find the Forge Master and the Merchant Guild Master looking at him. "As strange as this might sound," Rango Bhatt said, "this doesn't feel like stone at all." The two dwarves exchanged a glance. He had no idea what it meant. "I hope you don't mind us asking," the Master of the Merchant Guild said, "but what's a Rango Bhatt?" "Ah, that has a bit of a story behind it. But it's not complicated." As he spoke, a waitress, or maybe a barmaid, slid a half-dozen foamy mugs over the table. One of them stopped directly in front of him and he leaned forward to take a whiff. "Alcohol for lunch? I hope it's not too strong." The two dwarves waited expectantly behind their foamy beards. Rango Bhatt took an experimental sip out of his mug. Simply put, he licked the spicy foam off of his upper lip. "I was granted my title just recently and the survey results aren't in yet. I'd like to take advantage of what you have to offer, but, without knowing what's on my land, I can't even decide what title to use or what I need." "A window shopper, huh?" The Forge Master crossed his arms. "That's as good a way to put it as any." Rango Bhatt smiled slightly. "I apologize for any expectations I've betrayed." "No, there's no harm in it," the Forge Master waved his hand dismissively. "It isn't as if I throw my hammer at everyone that pokes their head into my shop and doesn't buy anything." "You have your own shop?" "Of course. Does the Empire have a Forge Master that doesn't run their own forge?" "Sorry, we don't have a Forge Master. Our Empire's Court Council is composed of administrators that oversee the direction of the state," Rango Bhatt replied. "They don't directly participate in industrial activities." Is that so? You humans are strange fellows. How do you know how things work if you don't do it yourselves?" "We sometimes get complaints like that from the common folk," Rango Bhatt chuckled. "But being an administrator is a vocation in itself. I would return your question by asking how your administration works without proper administrators." "Humph, if the Regency Council was filled with cabinet secretaries, we wouldn't get anything done. So, what's the usual process of land development in imperial territories?" A platter of thinly sliced cuts of meat appeared before them, followed by bowls of thick stew that gave off the musty odor of fungus. The stew was unflavored, creating an earthy counterbalance to the cured meats and spiced ale. "Arable land is identified and cleared for agriculture," Rango Bhatt replied to the Forge Master's question. "Woodlands growing in areas unsuitable for agriculture are managed for what they're worth." "What about mineral wealth?" The Master of Caves and Mines leaned in from his side of the table. "That has always been a challenge for the Empire," Rango Bhatt said. "The Imperial Ministry of Magic has mainly focused on arcane magic over the generations and divination has never been fashionable. Most of our mines begin as veins of ore exposed on the surface. I am considering commissioning the Sorceress Kingdom's Adventurer Guild to see what they turn up, however." "The Adventurer Guild, huh? Well, they did a passable job in Fiotivaz. I suppose they'd naturally beat us out at surface work." "No matter what they find," Rango Bhatt said, "I'll still be interested in hiring your people. The infrastructure we've seen on our visit surpasses Imperial engineering by far." "That so?" the Forge Master said after calling for another round of drinks. "Well, we have a whole slew of up-and-coming companies that are itching for the chance to show their stuff." Rango Bhatt reached into his coat, producing a quill and a bottle of ink. He summoned several sheets of paper, listening intently to the Forge Master as he recorded the details of the dwarves' offerings. As he flipped over the first page, he sent a glance at Countess Wagner, who was happily chatting away with Frian, Dimir, and the Director of Food Production. "This is just too convenient." Baroness Saradnik's letter of introduction. His promotion to Viscount. The Adventurer Guild's offer, followed by a visit to the Dwarven Kingdom. He didn't know what would come next, but he could only imagine that it would be yet another beneficial offering. His upbringing as a member of the imperial establishment caused him to question the entire course of events. There had to be a hidden price for everything, and it seemed that he could only wait for his benefactors to collect their dues. Time to pay up. Rangobart froze halfway out of the door to his room. Lady Wagner stood in the corridor outside, adorned in her carnelian dress. The outfit suited her so well that he doubted that any but the wealthiest of noble women might question her unchanging garb. Pay up for what, my lady? Lady Wagner looked up at him, her topaz eyes going wide in shock. Then, her gaze went to the stone floor as she covered her face in her hands. Did it truly mean so little to you, my lord? She sobbed. Nearby, a maid and a footman whispered to one another while stealing scandalous glances in their direction. Rangobart contemplated his options. He could fly out of his window, out of the city, and back to the Empire, but it probably wasn't enough to escape. I fear to ask what I owe you, my lady. In response, Lady Wagner latched onto his arm with a pleasant smile and walked him down the corridor. Let's begin with a meal, shall we? She said. I'll introduce you to my favorite place in all of Fioberkana. I hope my purse will survive this. Now that he was no longer a third-class Imperial Knight, his resources would only dwindle until his new title started generating revenues. Most Imperial Knights undergoing that transition borrowed money from any number of lenders, who were all too happy to hold debts over the newly landed soldiers. Rangobart, however, had been coasting along with his father's party and the generosity of his hosts. Nobles were generally loose with budgeting petty expenditures, and it was a normal practice for aristocratic scions, but he was now in the awkward position of being a new landed lord trying to make an impression on potential business partners. They emerged from their inn in the Dwarven capital's foreign quarter, pausing for a moment before joining the flow of traffic on the street. The sea of beards around them seemed to pay no special attention to the appearance of two humans. This city never seems to sleep, Rangobart said. The streets are just as crowded as when I retired for the night. A perk of having dark vision, Lady Wagner said. The people here aren't dependent on daylight for work like most humans are. It makes their infrastructure utilization that much more efficient, too. The city can have way more activity when it's spread throughout the day, and taxes are doubly effective, well, more than that when you consider everything in its entirety. Is that why dwarves have the reputation of being industrious? In part, maybe. They're a hard-working, competitive people even without it, or at least they are now. What do you mean by that? Rangobart asked. Early on, just after the Sorcerer King established our relationship with the dwarves, they just sort of existed, if that makes any sense. You know, like an old, tired artisan who's pretty much done. That guy who only works because they need to eat. Well, from what you told us about them, they were in a rather hopeless situation. Maybe. Anyway, it wasn't until a few weeks after they started moving back to their capital that they seemed to wake up all at once. It was like their entire race was sleeping, and now they're as you see. It was hard to envision what she was describing, especially when the dwarves appeared to wear dour expressions out of principle. They generally weren't very animated unless they were caught up in something they were interested in. Lady Wagner brought them along the main street toward the city entrance until they came to the crowded junction to the industrial quarter. As with the previous day, a long line of ore wagons being drawn by soul-eaters formed a queue that made the morning traffic at our winter's gates look light. How much ore do they process per day? Rangobart asked as they walked past the line of stuck wagons. Lots, Lady Wagner said. I wouldn't be surprised if they're refining more metal than the Empire and Riestais combined 10 times over. They don't burn fuel like we do, they use heatstone, and that puts their production on a whole other level when it comes to steel production. The thing is that it's only a fraction of the city's full industrial capacity. They can restart as many forges as they'd like, but they have nowhere near the skilled labor required to operate them all. It's going to take centuries for Fioberkana to return to its former glory. Even with the assistance of undead labor? Yup. They seem undaunted by the prospect. Comes hand in hand with being long-lived, I guess. A dwarf lives 4 or 5 times as long as a human. An elf lives 3 times longer than a dwarf. Can you imagine how a being like a dragon thinks? I can't. The Sorceress Kingdom has many immortal beings, doesn't it? Yeah, but that doesn't mean you can understand how they think. When you speak with a dragon or demon or whatever, they always seem to make a point of underscoring the difference between themselves and you. The legends do always seem to include that in their characterizations. Lady Wagner puckered her lips as she looked up at the cavern ceiling, cradling the back of her head with her hands. Rangobart looked up, as well, just in time to see the ghostly silhouette of a frost dragon glide silently by overhead. This might sound weird to you, Lady Wagner said, but those legends we hear are meant for human ears. You're right. It does sound like an odd thing to say. Well, what I mean is that those characterizations seem to exist to soothe our egos. The bards always play the bad guys up as monstrously strong or cunning or having magical whatever, then, bam, they have a flaw. A weakness. Vanity. Hubris. Ignorance. Soapy water. Something that the hero can exploit to prove that humanity can prevail against its enemies. After being around all that legendary stuff for a while, I can tell you it doesn't work like that. But many of those weaknesses described in the legends are real. Sure, but expecting them to work as advertised is like expecting humans to just run around naked because they don't have natural weapons and armor. If something has a weakness, they'll try to address those weaknesses if they can. In the worst case, a monstrously powerful opponent will still squish you despite your knowledge of those weaknesses. We've had to rejigger the way we see things in the Sorceress Kingdom, even with other mortal races. Is that a good thing, or a bad thing? Dunno, Lady Wagner held out her hands and shrugged. It just is. Reality. I guess that makes it a good thing when you have to work with all sorts of people. If I have to work with a bunch of ogres, I can't just throw up my hands and cry about how I'm surrounded by idiots. In the grand scheme of things, ogres are actually more successful than humans, which means that they're smart enough to do what they need to do. I just need to figure out what they can successfully do. Dwarves are stubborn. Vampires are haughty. Demons suck at diplomacy. Just got to figure out how to make it all work. Doesn't that mean you're still exploiting those characterizations in the end? Rangobart noted. Not at all, Lady Wagner replied. Like I said, the old legends tell stories that stroke your ego. Never mind the old legends, news being spread about current events does the same thing. Don't think we haven't heard what they say about the Sorceress Kingdom and how people are trying to figure out how to fight us. Not that they'll succeed, they're preparing for an imaginary battle that will never happen. Well, not unless they do something stupid, but we're not starting anything. Well, if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't think it's unreasonable. A lord's responsibility is to protect their land and its people. Even if misguided, not making their best efforts to fulfill their obligations would be negligence that should disqualify them from their post, Countess Wagner scoffed. Best efforts, huh? Even our client state doesn't have a diplomatic mission in the capital, and it isn't due to a lack of volunteers for the assignment. The only country with something like normal diplomatic channels set up with us is the Draconic Kingdom. Well, I guess the dwarves set up a tavern, but all everyone else is doing is making up their minds about us without bothering to open a dialogue. It was a difficult position to argue against. At the same time, it wasn't as if he couldn't understand their trepidation. That a country ruled by an undead sovereign was nothing but an existential menace to its neighbors was the rational conclusion nearly everyone would come to. In that situation, sending diplomats was no different than sending talented civil servants to a meaningless death. Rangobart grew puzzled as they continued following the long line of ore wagons, leaving the foreign quarter to enter the industrial quarter. I thought we were going somewhere for breakfast, he said. We are, Lady Wagner replied. Not long after passing through the gate, they stopped at the end of a long line of dwarves in rugged working garb. Rangobart leaned to the side to see where it led, but the line disappeared around a corner. So, Lady Wagner said, did you like what you saw yesterday? Rangobart stared blankly at her question, recalling the pale curve of her bare shoulder in the reflection of the carriage window. After several moments, Lady Wagner's face turned red. That's not what I meant. She hit him on the shoulder so hard that he went tumbling to the pavement. The dwarves nearby shook their heads. Get some meat on them bones, lad, one of them said. Are merchant nobles supposed to be that strong? Maybe she negotiates with demi-humans by fighting them. Sorry. Lady Wagner leaned forward and pulled him to his feet, I meant whether there was anything on the tour yesterday that you liked. There was a lot that I thought might be useful. Rangobut brushed himself off. House Gushmund will almost certainly give them plenty of business. Indeed, they had stayed the night because Frian needed more time to sort everything out for her family. He wouldn't be surprised if Dimia arranged for something for her own family, as well. The line shifted forward, taking them around the corner. To Rangobut's surprise, the line didn't lead to a restaurant, but a stall on the street. What are they serving? He asked. Nook bowls, Lady Wagner answered. They are super popular. I can see that, but I would have never thought this was your favorite place in the city. It's not, but it's near my favorite place in the city. When it came their turn, Lady Wagner pulled 2 containers out of the satchel at her hip. The dwarf working the stand unceremoniously ladled a steaming stew into both. Lady Wagner flipped a few copper coins into a stone bowl before picking up one of the containers. I thought I would be paying. There are more important things than money, Lady Wagner told him. Let's go. He picked up the second container and followed the Countess deeper into the industrial quarter. They arrived at some sort of yard shortly after, where Lady Wagner seated herself at a row of stone benches. This is my favorite place in Fioberkana, she said. There wasn't anything noteworthy about it, at least from what should have been a noblewoman's perspective. The yard lay between 2 forges and the air was filled with the sound of bellows and ringing hammers. A dwarf walked past them, carrying a crate of metal bits, upending them into a half-filled wagon. The dwarf left without so much as a glance at the strangers along the way. Rangobut walked over to join Lady Wagner. On impulse, he ran his fingers over the surface of the bench, then frowned when they came up blackened with soot. Oops, Countess Wagner said. Lady Wagner rummaged around in her satchel and produced a white towel. A swirl of magic erased all traces of dirt from the bench. Then, she used the item on herself. There, she sat back down and patted the bench beside her. All better. I didn't know you had troopers' towels in the Sorceress Kingdom, Rangobut said as he sat down to join the Countess. We got our hands on a bunch of surplus when the Imperial Army was reorganizing. I see. That might explain a few things. More than a few Imperial knights eagerly waited for the prices of certain items to drop so they could get them at bargain prices, but they didn't budge a single copper. The Sorceress Kingdom had apparently foiled their plans. So, this is your favorite place in the city, huh? Yup, Lady Wagner nodded. I guess I live up to my family name. Forges, workshops, and horses were what I grew up around. Here, I get to watch the dwarves make all of their things. Do you do any smithing yourself? Rangobut asked. Nah, the Countess waggled her spoon in the air. I'm just a merchant noble, just like my lord father and his father and his father and his father before him. You were merchants before that? Pretty much. Just before the empire split, House Vaself was looking for people to help develop the area around D. Rantle and my family jumped at the chance. And that's how you became merchant nobles. Yeah, E. Rantle ended up with a bunch of them due to how things played out back then. Only 3 of us are left, though. How do you think that affects our chances with the imperial nobility? Her question gave him pause, which in turn caused the Countess' expression to wilt. I'm sorry, he said. Honestly, it's a mark against you. Most will believe that your ancestors didn't earn their titles through legitimate means. I wonder how long that will be a thing for, Lady Wagner sighed. Maybe forever, I guess. I tell ya, it was a lot easier when it was supposed to be me being married off. Most nobles are all too happy to collect a big fat dowry through their spares. You haven't considered marrying a merchant's son? Lady Wagner gave him a funny look. That's not something I expected you to suggest. Rangobut laughed despite himself. She was right. He knew very well that women rarely, if ever, wanted to marry down. Then you are in a most difficult position, my lady, he said. I know, right? Yeah, no, I was actually considering a certain Rangobatra Burbad. Florine was, too. Wait, both Lady Wagner and Lady Gonye? Are they from Carnassus or something? The wild imagery associated with women from Carnassus threatened to push all other thoughts out of his mind. He didn't know what Baroness Gonye looked like, however. Neither of our big sisters disapproved, Lady Wagner continued, so we figured it might work. Then you went and got yourself promoted. For some reason, Countess Corlin and Baroness Saradnik entered the scene in his imagination. He shook his head free of the rapidly degenerating scenario. "It wouldn't have worked even if I hadn't," Rangobart said. "A war wizard in the Imperial Army is bound to be granted land at some point, so the Empire would reject the Union." "Weren't you trying to seduce Ludmilla last winter?" Rangobart coughed around his spoon. "Who else knew about that?" "My family instructed me to court her," he said after he caught his breath. "They figured a connection to the Sorceress Kingdom would give them an insurmountable advantage over their rivals, perhaps even the Emperor. The idea was that she would willfully marry me into her house and not even the Emperor would be able to say anything about it." Hold on," the young noblewoman held out her hand. "I'm thinking. Am I in danger?" "You think that would work?" Lady Wagner asked. "Would the Sorceress Kingdom even care about something like that?" "I guess you're right." "Well, no, actually, our liege would reject the union." "Yours? Why?" "Oh, you know. Reasons." Were they ending the noble lines of Eranthal by arbitrarily rejecting every proposed union? If so, it was tyranny beyond even the most villainous fiends in history. He considered asking her about it, wondering if it was a plea for help, but decided that was probably too sensitive an issue to casually discuss. "Are you going to take the same approach with the rest of my Lord Father's party as you did with us?" Rangobart changed the topic. "I doubt it," Lady Wagner said. "This trip was to test the waters for various things and I can't say they won't be insulted if we don't observe the formalities that they expect. I'll have to counterbalance the dwarves' mannerisms to make things work out smoothly." She probably had the right of things. It wasn't simply a matter of personal pride, but also the impression that the nobles would take back with them to the Empire. Despite being so warm and friendly on their tour, Lady Wagner clearly understood what she was doing. Even with Rangobart, everything that had happened covered exactly what the Imperial Knights that might ask about the dwarves' offerings wanted to hear. Once they finished their knock bowls, which didn't taste all that different from beef bowls, they went to take a closer look at a few of the things Lady Wagner had noted from afar. Rangobart circled a strange iron container roughly the height of a dwarf as the Countess chatted with one of the foremen. "How's the new cable car network coming along?" she asked. "You say that as if it can be replaced overnight," the foreman huffed. "Those damn Quago nibbled everything down to the anchor bolts and we're still running the numbers on the test systems." "What's a cable car network?" Rangobart asked. "It's like a clothing line," Lady Wagner answered. "Except instead of hanging clothing, they hang buckets full of ore to transport to the industrial quarter. You didn't think they just settled for traffic jams every day, did you? You don't know until you know." It was an example illustrating Lady Wagner's point about the pitfalls of human presumption. The dwarves may have been so stubbornly defensive that their attitude created infrastructure bottlenecks, but it didn't mean that they left it at that. They simply came up with a solution that facilitated their stubborn stance. Not only did they have a solution, but the solution was older than the Baharuth Empire. "Will this system improve the industrial quarter's output once it's operational?" Rangobart asked. "No," the foreman said, "it'll just clear up the damn traffic. Solitas drive the wagons themselves, so it doesn't free up any more of our people than before." "This guy a new customer?" "This is Rangobart," Lady Wagner said, "a Viscount of the Empire. He's got an empty piece of land that he's trying to figure out what to do with and he doesn't have a single tenant." "And I thought we had it bad." "Well, a venture like that is something the merchants in the foreign quarter can easily figure something out for. Anything special about that land of yours?" "A few of the dwarven representatives that I've spoken with suggest that my land is in a volcanically active area. They were surprisingly excited about that." "It's not surprising at all," the foreman said. "You probably have all sorts of goodies on your land." "I guess we'll see what the Adventurer Guild turns up," Lady Wagner said. Rangobart followed Lady Wagner around several other foundries, most of which were refining steel for the Sorceress Kingdom. They eventually came across Frian and Dimir, who were being led around by the Forge Master and the Master of the Merchant Guild. "Figure it all out yet?" Lady Wagner asked. "I think we've settled on a decent start," Frian answered. "I've decided to award several dwarven companies 24 public works projects that the Imperial administration has categorized as low priority. I don't see my Lord Father rejecting the decision." "What does low priority translate to?" "At a glance," Frian said, The first of them is due for completion a dozen years from now, but higher priority projects will always pop up to push that time frame back. In short, it will never get done. Rangobart nodded silently. In the eyes of the Imperial administration, how critical any public project was depended on how much it potentially gained or lost the Imperial economy. Frontier territories with vast reserves of untapped wealth and tracts of agricultural land unconnected to the Empire's transportation network were prioritized over well-developed fiefs that at least had dirt roads going between all of their villages. With the recent expansion of the Imperial frontier, he doubted that the Imperial heartlands would get any attention in the near future unless some natural disaster destroyed their infrastructure. This, of course, was one of the many grievances that the civilian aristocracy had with the Imperial administration and a common example that they pointed to when labeling it as a faceless monstrosity that only served its selfish appetites. Even members of the Imperial dynasty were only shown any favor if the work was necessary for propping up the power of the Imperial house. Rangobart supposed that, too, was becoming increasingly unnecessary due to the Sorceress Kingdom's involvement in Imperial affairs and its results. You'd think that some companies would have long popped up to offer an alternative to the Imperial army for this kind of stuff, Lady Wagner said. The demand's basically always there, yeah? That thought crosses everyone's minds at least once, Freyan said. The fact of the matter is that no one can match the Imperial army in civil engineering, and anyone aspiring to the field goes to the Imperial army. They have all the expertise, manpower, and experience, plus they end up with all of the work. What will happen when dwarven companies start competing with the Imperial army? The Empire ultimately profits off of their efforts at no cost to itself. So long as the balance of power stays in the Emperor's favor, I doubt anything will happen. As far as House Gushmund is concerned, we'll finally be able to address various issues with our internal infrastructure. Have you given the bypass idea any more thought? What's that? Rangobart asked. An evil plot, Lady Wagner answered. It's not evil, Freyan frowned. Lady Wagner smiled an evil smile that made Dimir back away a few steps. The gist of it is to wrangle up enough nobles to create a new road network that's better suited to our advances in logistics, Countess Wagner said. For instance, it takes about a week for a regular, horse-drawn wagon to go from Erantal to Ingelfort with perfect weather. The Imperial nobles between us and the border can commission the dwarves to build new roads in their territories. Solita-drawn wagons can then deliver freight from Erantal to Ingelfort using those new roads in 6 hours. The nobles can charge tolls for the use of those roads, which any rational merchant would happily accept so long as it's cheaper than the week of operating costs they'd have to pay otherwise. What if the Empire commissions the dwarves to pave the main highways in response? Then the nobles still have dwarven road networks for their fiefs, Lady Wagner shrugged. Those pay themselves off in the long run anyway. When it comes to dealings between multiple parties, you Imperials are used to having winners and losers. Our proposal offers a choice between winning and winning bigger. Though she said so, Rangobart could think of a few losers resulting from the proposal. In particular, he dreaded to find out how the temples would react. Maybe Countess Wagner wasn't entirely wrong in calling it an evil plan, as the temples certainly would. It took a few more hours for Freyan to finish settling her family's business. After that, their dwarven hosts insisted on lunch. By the time they were waiting to get out of Fioberkana, it was well past noon. The three noble women were quick to don their lizardman blankets after seating themselves. So, Lady Wagner asked as their carriage started and stopped for the 5th time, how was Fioberkana? Too much to see in such a short span of time, Freyan said. I'm sure I'll be paying them another visit, however. Next time, I'd like to explore more of their culture and history. Actually, I didn't get to see any of their magic at all. Rangobart silently agreed. A day and a half was too little. Unlike Freyan, however, he doubted that he would have the time to visit again. Are we seeing anyone else on this tour? Dimir asked. Unfortunately, Lady Wagner answered, we have to haul ass back to Corlin Harbor. Gotta bring the next set of nobles on their tour. We have our visit to Warden's Vale, as well, Freyan said. Oh, yeah. Dimir said, and then her look turned serious. We are going to the frontier. Do you think we'll have to fight? Freyan and Dimir looked over at Lady Wagner. Now that you mention it, Lady Wagner said, you may end up doing just that.